I'm a nurse who works the night shift, and there have been 2 different occasions when I've been stalked on my way home. I'd like to share them with you. This happened when I lived in Chikawa, Tokyo. I was returning home on the last train of the night, and it was around 12:30 a.m. When you get off the train and exit the subway, there is a convenience store at the top of the stairs. My apartment at the time was about 7 minutes away from this store in a residential area. At that time of night when you get off the last train home, the lights of the convenience store are pretty much the only light source in the area. The roads are usually empty as well. Back to the story. I was climbing up the subway stairs, and I noticed a man waiting at the top of the stairs staring at me. He kept widening his eyes as he stared at me. He was shifting around restlessly. At that moment, I knew the guy was weird. I ignored the traffic lights and I crossed the road. I took a quick look over my shoulder and I decided quickly to walk home since the situation was a bit creepy. As I was walking, I felt a presence behind me. I looked over my shoulder and noticed that the weird guy from the subway was following me, and he was closing the distance between us. Without any hesitation or thought, I instinctively started running. I remember running like crazy. I was so panicked and frightened. There was no one on the streets to help me, no cars passing by, and it was so dark. I ran up a path into someone's private garden, pushed the gate aside, and hid there. I crept around the back of the house that looked over a road. I saw a taxi pass by and I saw my chance. The taxi driver must have seen how desperate I was and slowed down and saved me that night. After this event, I moved into an apartment right in front of a different train station. This area seemed much safer as it had a 24-hour taxi rank, buses, and well lit. And also it was busy with people even at night. It was pretty reassuring. I had been living in my new place for about 2 years when something else happened to me. Of course, it took place when I was coming home from my night shift. In those 2 days when I left the hospital to go home, I used to take a shortcut through a dark alley. It was there that I was certain that I met the same man again. I quickly headed to the train station. I boarded my train and saw him again as I sat down. The man was staring at me. He must have followed me onto the train. I had a terrible feeling about this. He kept glancing at me and fidgeting in his seat. The train pulled into my station. I got as close as I could to the doors, and as soon as they opened, I ran as fast as I could. I ran to an exit that I knew would be busy. I took off my jacket and tried to blend into the crowds of people. When I found a safe place to hide, I looked over my shoulder. He was there, desperately searching the area. I knew how much danger I was in. Luckily, there was a police box at the west exit of the station. In the following days, I became paranoid that that man might know where I live, or be waiting to ambush me next time I got off the station. I told the police everything that I could about the man. One of the officers seemed to know the man I was speaking of, and described him as perverted. When he said that, shivers went down my spine. There are lots of young nurses in Japan who work late like I did back then. It's been 10 years on, and I still get creeped out thinking about it. As peaceful as Japan is, be careful while walking home at night.
This happened to me when I was at elementary school. It would usually take me about 30 minutes to walk home from school. On the way home, there was 2 sets of traffic lights on a big 2-lane road. My school was by the seaside. I loved it. I used to walk in a group of close friends of about 3 or 4. We used to chat about the latest fads and fashion, homework, that sort of thing. It was a really fun time for me when I think back on it. It was summertime in my 3rd year of elementary school. As usual, I was waiting for my friends outside in the playground after school had finished. I noticed an old man in a white car staring at me through his open window. At first I thought he was a child because he was very short and very petite. He was so sunken in his seat I could barely see him. Not to mention, he had his cap pulled down just above his eyes. I remember that the cap had a logo on it. His skin was slightly sunburned too. He looked to be about 40 or 50 years old. He fully rolled down his window, leaned over the passenger seat and called out, "Hi! I'm sorry to tell you, but your dad has been involved in an accident. He's been rushed to the hospital. I'm one of your dad's friends, and I'm here to take you to see him in the hospital." Of course, when you hear something as terrible as that, it's going to shock you. But I had never met this old man before. When you're younger and an adult tells you to get in a car, you listen, right? Especially when they say something like that. I didn't know what to do. What was I supposed to do right now? My legs were frozen solid. It was at this point one of my friends arrived. I began to tell her about what I had just heard from the old man in the car, but our conversation was interrupted. "Hurry up, your dad's waiting for you," ordered the old man in the white car. My friend and I said nothing. "Your dad asked me to come and get you," he called. Those words upset me. I didn't know him, but I was so worried about my dad. I was only in the 3rd year of elementary school. I was so confused and very wary of the situation. Something in my gut told me that this was very dangerous. This standoff between us and the old man in the car went on for about 10 minutes. It was agonizing. Until he said, "Fine, don't get in. I hope your dad forgives you." He rolled up the window and started the car, drove off. I watched that car driving away. I had conflicting feelings of guilt for not accepting the ride with him to see my father in the hospital, yet I had strongly felt that it was not safe. After a while, my friend and I decided to head home as usual. I was nervous all the way home as we walked along the seafront. I got home and spoke to my mother about what had just happened. She confirmed that the creepy old man was a liar. She reported this to my school and to the police. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I am so glad you didn't get in that man's car." The next day at school, all the students were gathered and given a warning about this strange man and told about what had happened to me. The teacher explained that if you see an older man wearing a cap in a white car and he tells you that a family member or a friend has gotten into an accident and he will take you to the hospital, do not believe him and get away from him as fast as possible. I found out at a later date that a child had gone missing not too far from our school, and the child's whereabouts were unknown. It was said that the child had been tricked into getting into a stranger's car, and the police were currently conducting an investigation. I do not know how that case ended, but I do pray that the child was returned safely and the perpetrator was arrested. I mean, what would have happened to me if I had gotten in that car? I'm much older now, but I think about this often. And when I do, I always break out in goosebumps. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was living alone in the Chiba countryside, going back and forth to university. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, and it was tiny, narrow, and a dirty place, but I liked it at the time. It was fine for me. I met a guy at uni, and we started dating. It was a good time. About half a year passed. I was living next door to a good-looking office lady. I noticed one day that someone had left a strange-looking note on the small window next to her front door. Let me explain. In the hallway of the building at the top of the stairs, there's a frosted window that belongs to her apartment, at about head height on the right-hand side. About 70 centimeters by 40 centimeters. My boyfriend said, "What's that about? Maybe we should ask her next time we see her." I asked her about it, and she said she didn't know who had put that on her window. She said late one night she had decided to have a little peek through the window, and the second she looked out, a face appeared. It really freaked her out. It frightened me too. She said she stays at her boyfriend's apartment most nights now. I mentioned to her, if she ever didn't feel safe, or if anything happened, knock on the wall and let me know. I told my boyfriend that too, and he said that he would come straight away to help. I chatted with her in passing, time to time, and she said things had gotten worse. She was planning on moving out of the apartment block, And eventually, she did. That's when things started happening to me. When I was home alone, in times where I would be doing nothing but lying on my bed, I would hear this metallic tapping sound against my door. Since my apartment is tiny, you can easily see the door from the bed. Once, when I was looking over, I saw the door handle gently turning, as if someone was trying to quietly open the door. I didn't know who it was or what was going on. Keep calm, I told myself. For some reason, I called out, "The door's locked!" I heard heavy thuds against the door. They shook the glasses in the kitchen cabinets. Now I was freaked out. The thudding stopped eventually. Was someone trying to break in? So I called the police, and they offhandedly told me to beef up my security. That doesn't really solve the problem, though. Something else happened. Again when I was on my own in there. I remember that it was the end of January. Someone was trying to open the door again, but this time, a lot more violently. My whole body went rigid. Thank God I locked the door. Somehow, I found the courage to creep over to the door. I wanted to get a look at the person who was doing this. Someone was stood on the other side of the door. It was a guy. He had a bucket hat pulled way down to cover his eyes. My skin broke out in goosebumps. I was terrified. I wanted to get as far away from the door as possible. That wasn't easy to do in my tiny apartment. I ran to the other side of the room and called the police again, sobbing uncontrollably into the phone. Are they still there? Can you go over to the door and check again? Are they angry, do you think? The cop said. That really made my blood boil. Are you for real? Can't you hear the banging? I tried to keep my composure and not go off on him, and did as he requested. I looked through the peephole again, and the man at the door was still there, which sent me into a panic again. Even though there was a police station 5 minutes from my house, the policeman told me it was out of his jurisdiction. I pleaded with the guy, and he said he would send someone over to look over my place. They showed up 40 minutes later. Luckily, I called my boyfriend. He came from his part-time job. He arrived long before the police. He caught me on the phone to them and asked the officer, "Does she have to be dead before you come and check it out?" I half smiled at this, but the reality hit home. The person who was trying to break into my apartment was long gone. It's true, in Japan, the police won't do a thing until someone dies. I hate the police here. I'm sorry to say that, but that's just how I feel. The third time something happened, my boyfriend was in the apartment with me, thankfully. We were washing dishes in the kitchen and drinking tea. He suddenly felt a chill, and I felt it too. Then we both asked at the same time, "Are you cold?" He then asked me if a window was open. I looked in the direction of the window near my bed and saw it was open a crack. Then, I saw one human eye staring right at me. We must have stared at each other for about 10 seconds. I tapped my boyfriend's shoulder. I was too scared to speak. My boyfriend understood the message and ran towards the window, chasing after whoever was staring at us. However, that creep had a mountain bike positioned ready down below my window and got away. We couldn't have got down the stairs quick enough to chase him, living on the second floor and all. I saw him speeding away as I looked down from the corridor. One of the fence posts below my window had been broken, which is probably how he was able to climb up to the window. By the way, my bathroom is near the door of my apartment. Since it's a tiny place like I said before, I always had to make a short naked run to my dressing room across the hall, which makes me think that is why the guy had broken the fence and fashioned the ledge to stand on and peer at me. It's my guess anyway. It made my skin crawl. I applied for other apartments immediately after that incident. Also, shortly after this had happened, my boyfriend and I broke up. We didn't have a big falling out or anything, it just kind of fizzled out. I was glad that we were able to move on without any hard feelings, to be honest. We decided to split up over coffee one evening. He said he had to tell me something before we parted ways, though. He told me that he thought the guy who had been messing with me had been doing the same to the woman who lived next door to me, like a kind of stalker. I kind of already guessed that, to be honest. I was joking, trying to lighten the mood by saying, "I lost a boyfriend, but I gained a stalker." He went deathly quiet. I was really scared when that guy was staring at us in your room that night. There was something I didn't tell you, which I probably should have told you, he said. When I saw that guy getting on his bike, I noticed a huge knife in his hand. I'm so glad he was there at the time that creep came. Who knows what would have happened if he wasn't. I was able to move out, and my ex even helped me. He said I could call him any time I was frightened, but I haven't been scared once in my new place. What was the purpose of that guy messing with me? What did he want? To rob me? Was he a stalker? Or was he planning on doing something a lot worse? I think about it all the time. I don't ever want to be in that neighborhood again. Thinking now, that metallic tapping sound I heard against the door could have been the knife my ex mentioned. I don't like to think about that kind of stuff at nighttime. In case you're wondering, the apartment is still there. I'm an investigator. I'm going to tell you about the most disturbing stalking case I ever worked. This story takes place in the mountains. A few years ago, I had been entrusted to look into a sharp increase in the number of reported stalking cases in the area. I was placed in charge of a group to resolve these stalkings. I got a letter from one household, which simply read, "Please make the stalking stop." I decided to tackle this one first. The client hadn't been physically hurt by the stalker, but they said the stalker had been stood outside their family home, watching. The client who wrote to us wasn't the victim, but the victim's wife. She said she wanted this to end before somebody got hurt. The next day, I posted up near their family home and waited for the stalker to appear. However, there was no trace of the stalker that day, or for the rest of that week. I made an interim report to explain that the stalker hadn't been spotted. As I was explaining this to the client, she cut me off and blurted out, "The stalker's been here the whole time. Are you blind?" I showed her the photos I had took on the job and told her that I hadn't seen anyone. I couldn't believe that I had missed something. I could tell she was skeptical, so I asked her if she wanted me to continue with my investigation. She agreed, and I continued with the investigation, expecting to find nothing. At this point, I was questioning if the client was seeing things. Then, on the next day, I finally saw what the client was talking about. Someone showed up while I was staking out the house. I immediately started taking photos and shooting video, with the plan to show the client later that night. I showed my findings to the client and asked, "Is this her? Is this the lady who has been stalking your husband?" Her face went pale, and she nodded. Things intensified when I saw that woman again the next night. There was a car parked outside the client's house. I was with my colleague this time. He ran the plates with the Transportation Bureau and said he was told that there was no vehicle registered with that plate number. We decided to tail the car. It headed through the mountain roads. Because it was late night, no other cars passed us. We kept our distance and watched the car speed ahead. The stalker's car veered off onto a dirt road, then it suddenly stopped. We wondered if our cover had been blown. The car was stationary, but no one got out. We were far enough away, at the entrance of the dirt road. My colleague said, "She will notice if she hears a car coming. It's best you go by foot." I couldn't argue with that, but to be honest with you, I hated the situation. It was unnerving. I crept towards the stalker's car. It was parked next to an old, battered, dilapidated house. It looked abandoned. Could anyone really live here? I thought. I noticed there was no lights on in the house. The car did stop here though. The stalker's probably in there. I staked it out for about 20 minutes. I wanted to see if there was any signs of life in the house. It came from the house. It was such a terrible shriek. I started shaking. Then I heard it again. I was really freaked out. I ran back to the car to check on my colleague. But when I got back to the car, he was gone. I thought he would be waiting there for me to return. I called out to him, but the second I did, I heard a cell phone ringing. That cold, generic ringtone pierced through the mountain air. It was coming from a bush near the side of the dirt road. I crept over to take a look. The cell phone was lying on the ground. It was my colleague's phone. I went over and grabbed it and answered it. I heard some garbled speech, and then the phone cut out. I tried to call the number back, but the phone was out of signal. If he was waiting in the car, why would his phone be lying in the bushes? I heard more screaming coming from the house. What could be going on in there? Could he be in there? With that stalker? It was one of the worst moments of my life. It felt like my mind was thick with fog. I could not stand the terror. That scream. It was something I had never heard before, and something I haven't heard since. Suddenly my colleague's phone rang again, in my hand. I thought it was out of signal. Who the hell was calling? I answered it, of course. I just had to. I heard my colleague's voice again. I heard that same garbled speech. I panicked and ran. I had to get away. I ran to the car, threw open the door, got in, and locked it. I buried my head in my hands. I was shaking with fear. I waited for him. I didn't know what else I could do. The first light of morning came, and he still wasn't back. I went towards the house. I wanted to know what was making those noises in there, and if anything had happened to him. The stalker's car was still parked outside. Is she still there? I thought as I entered the house. There was nothing in that house, no sign of life at all. Yet I had heard all that screaming. It was so weird. The place was completely abandoned. I went back outside and looked in the stalker's car. It was really old and damaged. Looked like it could fall apart at any moment. The interior was full of dust too. I tried to consider how this could even be possible. I waited as long as I could in the hope that my colleague would suddenly appear and this would be all over, but after a few hours, there was no sign of him. I went back to the office to report what had happened last night and to see if anyone had heard from him. There was no news. The guys from my office came with me to check out the abandoned house, but again, we couldn't find a shred of evidence. We have been back there at later dates to check on it as well. There's been no sign of life there. After some time, my colleague's family reported him missing. Since there was no evidence of foul play, and we cannot identify a suspect or his whereabouts, the case is likely to go cold. I've been searching for any clue which could lead me to him again, but I have nothing. I couldn't even use the photos or the video I took. The files became corrupted. I went back to the client, and they said they hadn't seen the stalker since. What on earth happened? My colleague is still missing. I pray he will be found safely someday. Just wanted to say big thank you to SelestialNorre for helping me out on this video. I've been a big fan of his. In fact, I had my own sort of stalker weirdo experience when I was listening to one of his videos. I was sat in a restaurant in Japan, and a guy just came out of nowhere and came and sat down at my table, and he starts ordering all this food, and he starts talking to me, trying to find out where I'm from, and he just wouldn't leave me alone, basically. He was completely drunk, and he was an oddball because just glancing around all the time, and even when I went to the toilet, he followed me up there and back. So in order to get out of the situation, I waited for him to go to the toilet again because he was consuming an unholy amount of alcohol. And I went up to the counter and spoke to the waitress in my very limited Japanese at the time and said, you know, I don't know this guy. I don't want to pay for his food and drinks. I've got to get out of here. I'm paying for my share. Let me go, basically. And they did, and it was fine. But I found that quite an interesting tidbit as I was listening to the very man who took the time to collaborate with me and got me on the old spooky path. So big thanks again to SelestialNorre. He's a real sound guy, and he's given me some advice as well. I really appreciate it. And please, if you haven't checked his channel out, do it. He's more prolific than I am. He has great stories. And yeah, look forward to one day maybe doing another one with him. So thanks a lot. Subscribe, like, share, do all them things if you want. I can't be this kind of YouTuber, but yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next video in a serious voice.